Hi guys, welcome to the Seed Network, where we celebrate the achievements of Africans in Australia and learn from their stories and the positive impact they are making in their communities. I'm your host, Bol Mayen, and I'm very excited to introduce our next guest. She's a recent graduate of University of Melbourne, where she earned her Bachelor's of Arts degree. She's currently in her second year of law degree. She's a leader and advocate for her community, and she's actively involved with AYI, a non-for-profit organisation that supports and empowers young people. She's a kind and a caring individual, quoted by her sister. Please welcome Sobur. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Thank you for giving up your time. Before we get into studying law, before we get into AYI and other different organizations you've been involved in, let's start off with where you were born and early memories of that.
So I was born in Kakuma refugee camp in 2000. Kakuma is located in Kenya, and my family is originally from South Sudan, but they fled to Kakuma following the South Sudanese war. And so I was born there, and I don't have many memories as I came to Australia in 2004 when I was 3 years old, but a lot of my memories are tied to what my parents have passed down to me.
I love that. Talk a little bit more about what they've passed down to you. What do you know about the journey here? Let's talk about some of the positives that you've heard.
So, yeah, there are a few positives, but the main thing that I've gathered from my family's story is it was a very tough journey that they had to make. So prior to going to Kenya, my dad actually had to go through Ethiopia, and this is in a time where they didn't have cars or any easy mode of transportation, no planes. So he had to make the trek by foot, and it was like a grueling journey to freedom. And that was similar to my mum, because prior to living in Kenya, they had a life in South Sudan before the war. And so I see their story as a story of struggle, a story of sacrifice. And I guess it's really hard for me to imagine that, because my life hasn't been ever disturbed by conflict. I've never had to up and leave my childhood or my early adolescence to flee safety in another country. And so that's one of the main things I've gathered from their story. But apart from that, I see it as a story of resilience. I don't know if I'm able to do the same and have that same resilient mindset, but I guess they didn't really have a choice at the time.
I love that. And I know a lot of people had to go, a lot of people went to Kakuma refugee camps, a lot of people went out elsewhere. I went up to Egypt, and before Egypt, I had to go through Khartoum, which is the capital city of Sudan. Yeah. Where were you guys? Where was your parents from before they had to move?
My mum was from a place called Malakal. She was born in Malakal in a region close to Ural, and my dad was also born in Ural, so it's in part of South Sudan.
I love that. What is that place known for?
Like all places in South Sudan, they're known for their cows, known for a very rich and vibrant and warm and welcoming community. Like all tribes in South Sudan, there are unique aspects to it. And I guess part of like growing up in Australia has been trying to learn about that culture, where I come from as a South Sudanese person, as a Uralese person as well, and navigating my identity as both. But from what my parents told me, they were farmers. They gathered on Sundays to worship. They had a close-knit community. And life is very different from the life here, where it's like very up and go, 9 to 5. It's hard to connect with people sometimes because life is always on the move. Yeah.
I love that. How are you still learning about back home and where you're really from? How are you learning all these stories and these things about back home?
I guess a lot of it comes from my interactions with my parents. So when I was studying my arts degree, I took a subject called life writing in my final year. And prior to that, I was always into fiction. I read a lot growing up, and I really enjoyed like being transported into imaginary worlds and things like that. And I never thought to study biography or life writing was something that was quite foreign to me, but I did it as a challenge to myself. And I thought, like, I don't really read much memoir, I don't really know what the world of life writing is about. But that subject taught me how to, look at my life as a story worth telling. And as part of my focus, I focused on my mum's story. And so my mum was the subject of my short story, and I interviewed her about life growing up. What her life looked like before me. Because so much of my life I say, I came from a refugee background, this is what my parents did, but this is who I am now. And I had to really retrace my roots and go back to, a life before me. And so that's where I started learning more about what my mum did on a day-to-day basis, what our culture was like, what the times were like, the geography, the cultural fabric of South Sudan, and specifically her time living there in Ural and then later in Kakuma. And so I think that's where I gathered a lot of my information. I also am part of a church group, and I have a lot of elders, and they tell me stories about life back home, learning songs that speak to basically our history and our culture, is really something that I've recently discovered, and it's helped me to discover who I am. So I'd say that that's mainly where this comes from.
I love that. And from interviewing your mum and talking to elders and, digging up things about past, what's something that's very important or something that you're very proud of that you've learnt from where you're from?
I think it's our culture, and it's about what it means to be South Sudanese, a sense of identity. Because I think something that I really reflect upon is how we have a sense of belonging, we have a sense of togetherness that's really, really hard to explain in like here in Australia, where life is connected but can be disjointed sometimes. Hearing from my family's story, it was story of like unity and everyone coming together. I think that's something that makes me proud of being South Sudanese, because I guess coming here, hearing about your culture spoken about in such a negative way, you lose the appreciation for who you are. And that's also lost in things like language. Like if you don't speak the language, you kind of don't have an appreciation for the language. You don't have an appreciation for the nuances that make your culture what it is. And so I think that's what I admire most, the people, the Dinka way, the South Sudanese way, how we care for one another and how we love one another and care for our environment as well is something that's I've discovered, I'm still discovering, which is something that's really powerful and what I love about my culture.
I love that. What's a personal fun fact about Sudan or something that you've learned recently?
A fun fact about Sudan, something that I've learned recently. It's fun fact, like there's 64 tribes in South Sudan. I guess in community where I just know like 5 or 6, I don't know the diversity of being South Sudanese. It's not really a fun fact. It should be known more, but that's something that I discovered
until recently. Honestly, I think there's more than that.
Yeah,
minimum.
Really? Maybe.
Yeah. Well, there you go. Before we move on to the next thing, another thing that I found really fascinating recently was how significant our names are and stuff like that. My name is Bold. That's given to a child born after twins. Yeah. There's different names with very significant meanings. Your name is very significant as well. Your first and last name. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Okay, so my name's Sobur, and my first name means patience. It's actually an Arabic name, and I guess my parents called me Sobur because before I was born, my older sister was born, and then I was born, 2 girls. And in the Dinka culture, like we love boys a lot because men are the ones who pass down the family name, and they pass down the legacy of the family. And so my parents called me Sobur, meaning patience or wait, because a boy is soon to come. And my brother soon followed after me. And so my name and my brother's name are quite linked in that story. And my last name is Diu, which means grief or grieving. And they called, in South Sudanese culture, your last name is the name of your father. So your father's first name is your last name. So my dad's name is Diu, and he was called that because at the time of his birth, his uncle recently passed away, and so his family was in mourning. So they called him Diu because there was a lot of grief surrounding his birth. And so that's how my name came to be.
Well, there you go, guys. That was just an introduction. We'll be right back after this break. See you guys soon. Welcome back, guys, to the C Network. If you just joined, I'm here with Sobur, and we've just talked about an introduction. Now, let's talk about the journey to Australia. How was the journey? Do you remember much? And do you remember much at all?
I was very young, but I do remember parts of it. So we came from Kenya into Australia, where we settled in a small town called Lismore. It was very small at the time, in northern New South Wales, and that was in 2004. So I was quite young, and I went straight into kindergarten at the time, and my sister went straight into school, and my family settled in that in Lismore. And what I remember of it, we were really well supported, even though we were the first. We're one of the first African families having that migration journey from a war-torn country into Lismore. We were very well received by the council there. We made a lot of friends with the local people in Lismore, and they really supported my family to access things like, Centrelink and employment and education. And also, like, we did a bunch of recreational activities. I remember my childhood was just like going to Gold Coast on the weekends and coming back, playing the park a lot, going to school. I really enjoyed school. So I had a really positive migration journey, but that's only from the perspective of me as a child. I don't really know much about like what my family, what my parents experienced until later on, and how difficult it was to navigate like a completely different system. And so even though we were well supported, I could see that there were still challenges to come up against settling in a new society.
What are some of the challenges for now? There's a bunch of Africans that are born in Australia. What are some of the challenges that they might not understand at all about being, first generation Australian?
Well, I think part of it is, you're provided with such opportunity. When you're born in Australia, when you come at a young age, most of the time you don't really have that difficulty speaking English. And English is kind of like it's the dominant language here. So accessing services, excelling in your educational journey, just having opportunity is really something that we take for granted, because I guess a lot of our parents don't have the same opportunity because there's that English barrier. And even if parents are educated, they still have to go through the process of re-educating and getting qualifications that are actually recognised by Australia. And so a lot of first generation, young people who either came to Australia when they were quite young or were born here, they have to navigate that kind of tension of, being ahead of their parents in certain ways, which is, something that can put enormous stress on you. And I guess something that I was fortunate with is my parents were quite educated before. So my dad, I think he finished primary school or high school, and my mum too. And when they were living in the refugee camp, they actually worked with the UN as teachers. And so they had quite like good literacy. And so my dad was able to go straight into TAFE and get his qualification. So did my mum in early childhood education. My dad did finance, and then he ended up proceeding to get his bachelor's degree and then later on a master's degree, which is something that I take as a real privilege, because a lot of people don't have that same experience. And so I think that's a huge, like the language barrier is it's a huge challenge that many people experience.
For sure. And I know you're studying law at the moment, and you've graduated from your arts degree. How was going to high school and going to school before we get to high school? How was schooling in Australia?
Yeah, I loved school. So ever since I was in childcare, in kindergarten, I loved reading. And my parents really supported like my love for reading, because my dad used to take us to the library every Saturday or every Sunday, and we used to borrow books and come back, and we used to always go to Hungry Jack's. That was kind of like the ritual. And so I grew up with the real fondness for learning, and a real sense that I could do anything. And my teachers from kindergarten up until primary school, they really nurtured that. They really inspired and encouraged me to love learning, and so did my siblings and other friends in the community as well. So I had a really positive experience in primary school. When we came to Victoria in 2011, because my dad at the time had finished his degree and he was seeking better employment opportunities, I was launched into high school and like later primary school and then high school, and I had the same positive experience. I think the school that I went to was really inspirational. I had teachers that kind of really held my hand and really supported me to love school and to excel. And so school was never something that was a challenge for me. I think the biggest thing is navigating where you're heading afterwards, especially if you're somebody who has a lot of, you have a lot of love for subjects. It's hard to kind of think, where can I go? And although my parents were quite educated, I didn't have people in my family, my immediate family in Australia, who had studied law or who had, that experience to be able to tell me exactly what the career would look like. And so I opted to follow the route of a Bachelor of Arts degree, because I felt like when I graduated from high school, I still had a lot of passions that I wanted to explore. I didn't want to go straight into the law. So I went...
But did you know you always wanted to do law at one point?
Yeah, I did.
Where did that come from?
So it's kind of like a typical story when you are used to arguing a lot when you're young. Like, I had a sense of like, I always wanted to be right. And people used to always say, this girl's going to be a lawyer one day. And it was only until later that I realized like, that's kind of not that's not the core of being a lawyer, but people had pushed that.
What is the core of being a lawyer now? So I'm just interrupting because I'm very curious now. What's the core, in your 2 years of studying that, what's the core of being a lawyer?
I think understanding systems.
Perfect.
And helping people. I think that's what it is about. Being a lawyer, the law is a vast network. It's hard to, sometimes you can get lost in it. And I think it's about problem solving, identifying a problem and helping somebody navigate that system, that complexity, and to reach like a good outcome at the end of that. That's what it takes to be a lawyer. But I think at the time when I was encouraged, people saw my love for reading, people saw my love for writing and for standing up on behalf of other people. And so I guess that's why I was pushed into, like, not pushed, but encouraged to pursue law. And growing up, I had a real sense of right and wrong, a real sense of justice. And I thought I'd really want to end up in the law where I can make a career out of this. So that's where it kind of came from.
I love that. For people who are wanting to do law or arts degree, what advice do you have for the young people?
I think about what you're passionate about. Pursue your interests. Read and find out more about, the professions that you want to enter. I think law is an area where you can do anything with it. You could have any background and you can go anywhere with it. And I guess you get this stigma that it's something that's completely, like, it's an enormous thing to do, which is, it's hard, it's very intensive. But I guess if you know your reason for pursuing it and you have a legitimate interest that you want to explore, I'd say, go for it. Talk to people who have been through the law, talk to mentors, or do your research about, what kind of subjects you're going to be studying, what the field of law actually looks like, and then, go for it.
Well, there you go, guys. We're going to go for another ad break. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back, guys. If you just joined, I'm your host, Bolmayan, and I'm here with Sobur. So we just talked about studying law. Have you been lucky enough to get involved with any work or?
Yeah. So in terms of like my experience in the law.
Yeah.
So when I graduated from my arts degree in 2021, I actually had an opportunity to join a law firm in a community engagement kind of role, leading a project called the South Sudanese Business Response at Landon Rogers, which is a law firm here in Melbourne. And that was kind of like my gateway into the law. And I had joined the law firm just when I was, entering into my first year. And so it was a really great experience to be able to, be a student, like studying law, and then also to actually have experience at a law firm in an area that I was passionate about, which is all about, helping South Sudanese young people find employment through corporate spaces. And so I guess that's where a lot of my work experience comes in from the law.
I love that. And we also talked about earlier in the introduction, AYI. What is AYI?
AYI is a not-for-profit youth-led organisation that was formed in 2020. Basically a group of friends and I were really upset about what was happening in our community, especially around youth crime and how the media was portraying it. But we also we also knew that there was a gap there where South Sudanese young people and African young people in general were feeling disengaged from their culture, disengaged from education, marginalized to the fringes of society. And so we wanted to do something about it. And we didn't know at the time exactly what that would look like, but we just knew that we had passions, connections, and like a real energy for giving back to the community and trying to harness the youth voice. What do young African people actually want? Who are they? Instead of letting the media dictate for ourselves, like who we are and what we were doing in society. And so AY was formed in response to that. And since then, we've developed programs centered around sport, programs centered around education, mentoring, just things that young people want to do, and basically giving young people the agency back into their own lives and seeing the connections that were available to them in the community, instead of it always being this dialogue of go back to where you come from, look at the consequences of African migration. And I felt really sad because in my journey, I've always had such a positive experience, relating to the community. And so many of my colleagues at AYI did too. But what we were seeing was just this wave of hatred and this wave of disconnection. And so we wanted to do something about it. And it's been 2 years in the making. We're going to our third year now. And I guess over time, we've kind of developed what it is that we want to focus on. And we've really carved out our identity. We want to work in the youth justice space, but not in a way that is like, no, we don't provide any services. We don't provide case management, but we provide pathways for young people through recreational activities and through just fun things that young people want to do. So that's where we find our focus area with AYI.
I love that. And I know at one point in Melbourne specifically, there was a very tough time for a lot of African, especially South Sudanese people. But I think the positive out of that was it brought a lot of people from the woodwork to try to do something positive, to prove to people that that the narrative is completely wrong.
Yeah,
one of them is the C Network. That's why I started this whole show.
Yeah.
Is there anything else have you guys been involved in or created in order to get more people involved and more community work?
I guess, we have a range of programs, like from our sports programs, fitness programs for young women and kids. We have a partnership, several partnerships with community organisations working in sport to kind of elevate, African Australians in a positive light. And you know how powerful sport is. It can bring people together. So we have partnerships with the Western Bulldogs Community Foundation, which is really positive. And now we're actually partially inspired by you. We want to embark on a project called Reclaimed Voices, which is basically a project that aims to, create a genuine voice to the community, especially following on from those conversations and those narratives about youth crime, and how kind of our agency has been stripped away from us. We are launching Reclaimed Voices as a way to, reclaim our voices that have been lost in the destructive narratives. So we're working with our community to investigate the impacts of crime, to let victims share their story, and also people who have experienced youth justice or crime or the consequences of it to kind of share their story in a raw and unfiltered and genuine way without it being, diverted into those discourses about migration and race and, things that actually marginalize us even more.
I love that. With the work you've been involved in, hearing these stories and meeting these people who've also been so determined to make a change, how has that made you feel? How have you felt working in this field and trying to help people? How's that been?
I'm inspired every day, I think you can learn a lot from people from just hearing their story. It doesn't matter what level they're on, like whether they're speaking, very high level or whether they're just on the ground in community. I think I get a lot of my energy from just talking with people, hearing their voices and just sitting down and realizing that everyone comes from somewhere. And I think in society we tend to, polarize people, good versus bad, black versus white. And I guess when you actually have conversations with people and see where they come from, what their story is, and try to join the dots in society, it becomes a lot more positive. And so for me, I'm really energized by the work that everyone does, whether in a grand capacity or whether on like a very micro level. I think it's all impactful. And I think that's something that we can take to encourage ourselves, because we can all make an impact in any way.
Perfect. That was really amazing to hear. I got one more question before we wrap up, just like the show. It's called the Seed Network. And I believe everyone's here to plant something. What seed do you think you are here to plant?
I think I'm here to plant the seed of hope. it's something that's quite important to me, having hope for the future, and it's something that we as AYI are here to do. I guess when you talk about issues like youth justice and crime and unemployment, I think you can kind of drown in the sense of hopelessness that there's no way to come out of it. And I guess through talking with people in the community and really just embedding myself in community, I've seen the hope that so many people have been able to forge. And through connection making and just being visible, you can really make a difference. And I think that's what I'm here to do, to plant the seed of hope.
I love that. There you go, guys. That was amazing. Thank you guys so much once again for tuning in to the C Network to hear Sobur's story. I'm your host, Paul Mayen, and I'll see you next week. Peace.